This is Gemara Avodah Zarah Daf Samach. Hey, and we're holding on the bottom of Samach Daled Amud Beis. We like all the learning to be a continued refuah shlema for Gavriel Simcha, Mrim Ahuva B'Seich Sha'ar Chayli Yisrael. So we're holding 6 lines from the white lines, and we just quoted a brisa. Katani Miyah L'Shar Kol Devara V'Reu Ka'akol. So there's a diuk. And based on this diuk, the Gemara says that if Sharat Kol Dvarav, the din is that he has a din of an akum. The question is, Lamai Elchasa. It must be, you know what it means? Hareu Ka'akum, it means Lav de Mevatel Akvud, Chachamim Ka'akum, that he can nullify and Avodah Zarah like a guy. And therefore, that is a kasha on the shita of Rav Nachman that we just said. Well, that it can't be. Explains the Gemara, you know what it means as din of an akom, litin rishos. It means to give rishos, ulavatel rishos, and to nullify rishos. To a yid who shares his chotzer, and he wants to carry on Shabbos, just like a guy has such an ability to relinquish such a right, so too does this person as well. And as we learned in a brisa, Yisrael mumar mishamer shabbatoi b'shok. A Yisrael mumar, a yid of the derech, who is shomer Shabbos b'shok, meaning b'tzinon private, unfortunately doesn't keep Shabbos, but b'feresia it does keep Shabbos. Then the halacha is mevatel rishos. Then the halacha is he is allowed to relinquish his rights in his chutzner on Shabbos. Let's say he's not Shomer Shabbos Bashok, then Ein Mevatel Rishos, then he cannot relinquish his rights. Why? Nesha Amru Chazal have said Yisrael Neisin Rishos Mevatel Rishos. A yid has such an ability. Uba Akom Ad Sheyishkar. A guy you're not allowed to carry until he rents it out. Yishkar until he rents it out to a yid, and therefore a yid who is Mechal Shabbos for Hesya has a din of an akum, therefore he cannot relinquish the rights to such a chatzir. Says the Gemara, but in the event that he could, Ketzad, how does he relinquish his rights? Oimer loi. Someone says to his neighbor, Shusi Kanilach, my Rishus is transferred to you, Rishusi Mavutelesach, my Rishus is nullified to you, Kana, then the neighbor is Kaina. And there's no need to do an actual maisa kinyan, but rather the words themselves are going to be enough. Says the Gemara, a story. Rav Yehuda Shadlei Korbana. Rav Yehuda sent a gift, as we turn over to Samach Hey Amid Aleph. Who did Rav Yehuda send a gift to? He sent one to Lavidarna B'Yayim Edom, to a guy named Avidarna. And when did he send him the gift? Critically important. He sent it B'Yayim Eidan, on the day of one of the Goyish festivals. So Amar, he said, Yadana, I know Beinim Tiloi Polach Lakum. I know that this person doesn't worship an idol, and therefore you generally cannot give. This brings us all the way back to the very beginning of the Masechta. You're not allowed to give a gift to a guy b'yom Eidan on the day of their Yom Tovim, their festivals. In this case, it was okay. But as Rav Yosef Atanya, Yizeu ger toishav kol shekibul lav v'fnei gimel chavirim shalav avodas chavim. That's what has the status of a ger toishav, and therefore, if a guy would not be that way, it would have a different din. Explains the Gemara, Kitanya lachi yisa. To sustain him, if he falls into a pit and you want to give him life, you want to give him sustenance, that's what it's referring to. But not that he doesn't have a din of an akum, klabi dine akum. Of course, for that, he most certainly does. Asks the Gemara, that which you're talking about now is a ger toishav, who 12 months passes, and what does he not do? He doesn't take the final step of what? He does not have a bris milah. Arehu kimin. He has the status of a min shebaveres chavim of a guy. We see that even though he is a ger taishav, he makes the decision not to worship idols. But if he does not take that final step of getting a bris milah, he has a regular din of an akum. So ask the Gemara, Avidarna never did the full conversion. So why does Rav Yehuda, why was he allowed to give him a gift b'yayin v'edan? Says the Gemara, you know why? Hasam kigayin shekivulav lama v'leimal. Because Lamaisa, he was mekabel upon himself to do it, and that Kabbalah was enough that allowed Rabbi Yehuda, that is, to be able to give him a gift. And another story, Rava imtule korbana lebar sheishach b'yom edam. We're 10 lines down. The first word on line is korbana. Rava brought a gift to a guy named Bar Sheishach on the day of their Yom Tovim, of their holidays. Amar, said Rava, Yadanabe, I know about him. And then he went and he found Yosef Atzavare Bivarda. He went and he was sitting up to his necks in rose petals. Vekaiman Zainais Arumais Kamei. There were Zainais undressed, standing before him. Amar Le Bar Shishach said to Rava, Esachu Kaigamna La'amadasi. Is there such sort of hana in the next world? Meaning Rava thought this guy renounced idol worship, and he comes and he finds him sitting together with all these Zainais. And Bar Shishach says to him, such hana you have in the next world. And Amar Le Dida Nadiva Tvei Mihai. Rava says our pleasure in the next world, in Olam Haba, of course, will be even greater than this. Amar Le Bar Shishach says, Tvei Mihai Mihave. Is there even such a thing as hana greater than this? Amar Le, Rava says, I'll tell you what, maybe right now you have a momentary hana, but says Rava, be'etzem, you have the fear of the monarch, you have the fear of the government, meaning you're not absolutely carefree, enjoying even this hana. Anan, but us in the next world, loy teheve Allah, and we're not going to have a masad malchusa, meaning it's going to be pure, unbridled hana, lost in lavoi. So when Bar Shishach hears this, Amar Le, Bar Shishach responds, Ana miya, my imad malchusa ika. Says Bar Shishach, I don't really fear any government. Ad Yasvi, until one day they were sitting, Asahu Paristaka de Malka. And what happened was, a certain royal emissary arrives, and Amar Lane says to Bar Shishach, come, get up. The king wants him. A royal messenger comes and says, Bar Shishach, that the king wants you, showing that Rava is correct, and as much as Bar Shishach at the moment was having some level of hana, but in an instant it ended when the government calls him. Kinafik v'azal, when Bar Shishach was leaving, he said, Amar Le, Eina debayi, the eye that wished to see evil upon you, it should be detached from Isaki. Bar Shishach talking about himself. Amar Le, Rava responds, Rava, Amen. And what happens? Paka Eina Bar Shishach. The eye of Bar Shishach pops out of its socket, proving Rava to be correct. Says the Gemara, Amar Papi, commenting on this story, why didn't Rava respond for the following pasuk? B'nois malachim b'kurusecha nitzva shigal liminach b'chesem oifer. The daughters of the king will honor you. The king will stand on your right side in full of ophir gold. Now, what does this show us? This shows us that the pleasures of the Mahaba will be greater than anything else. Amar Rav Nachman, Rav Yitzchak explains, you know what he could have said to him? Another pasuk. Me'acha ayin lo yirasa alikim zulasecha yaseh lemechake loy. Different psukim that they could have quoted, and as much as Bar Shishach could not comprehend how there could be any greater hana from Sukkim, Rava could have proved that indeed there were. Continues the Gemara, the guy hires a worker to do a permissible work, and even if he tells him to move the yayin nesach from makim to makim, then the hana that's gone from that is mutter to get benefit from it. Says the Gemara. Now, the Mishnah that we just quoted did not differentiate when the schar is mutter. So says the Gemara of Vafal Gav, tell 9 to the bottom, first line is Vafal Gav. Tuesday Erev, even though he didn't tell him towards the evening, but rather he gave him during the day, sounds like still the schar is mutter. What's the shayla of Remini? Tuesday Erev, in the evening he said, then schar mutter. So the Bryce, it only sounds like this would be mutter. At the end of the day, says the Gemara, Taimad Amar Lei, the Tuesday Arevin, the Kule Alma Loi, says the Gemara, Amar Abaye, teaches Abaye, no. Ki Tanami Masnita on the Amar Li Tuesday Erev Tanani, you have to add those words into the Mishnah, the Teretz of Abaye. Rava comes along and he says, no, lo kasha. The difference is, was it one large job with one pay, or was it separate jobs throughout? Says really so Gemara proves that which we just said, that it would differentiate between whether they were hired all together or each barrel on its own. We continue on the third by line, according to the Mishnah, schari aser, a donkey to transfer yayin nesech, the schar is aser. Hasul Amar Li Ainu Reisha, says the Gemara. It's the same thing as the Reisha. Explains the Gemara. You know what the Chiddush is? Seifa Tzrichalei. You know why? Because in the Seifa, what happened was the Scharai Leishiv Alav B'Sheiniach Akum Liginoy Alao Scharai Mutter. The Seifa, there was another case. In the Seifa, there was the case that if he hired to sit on the donkey, then even if he places yayin nesach on it, the schar is mutter, because that is not what he hired him for. So the second din in the Mishnah, you're right, it's repetitive. The first din is the chiddush. Says the Gemara, Lememer delagin lav dinu lisuve. It sounds like the renter does not have the right to put his flask down. Sounds like you rented to ride the donkey. You happen to put your yayin nesach down, so it doesn't make it aser, which would mean that the right to put your flask down is a separate right. Says the Gemara, "V'remini aseiches chamar seicha miniach ala ksusa l'gina seicha miniach ala ksusa." The renter can put the ksusa on the donkey, or l'ginasai u'mizaynaisay shalaisay aderech mikan ve'ela chamar makiv lav chamar miniach ala schar v'tavidim zenish shalaisay yom mikan ve'ela schar makiv lav. So we see in the breakdown of who has the rights out, like we just said. Amar Abaye explains Abaye Nehid Login Dino Huli Suve. You're right that the renter put his flask there, but however Mia Eloi Maisiv Lo, if he doesn't, then Mia Minale Nechile Agra Delaginasa, do we subtract that value? Of course not. So says the Gemara, okay, so now you're making this differentiation, Echi Dami. What exactly is going to be the case? If there is mizaynos kamin, then the chamar, the driver, could as well prevent the renter from putting extra baggages on the donkey. Says, listen, I create this differentiation. Who's allowed to put their stuff on the donkey? It should depend. Are there mizaynos? Are there rest stops on the road? If there are, then no one can put their extra stuff on the donkey. If they're not, then everyone should yes be allowed to. Amar there is, if you're matriach yourself you could buy a 1 day's journey. So chamar darkil mitzvah lemezvan. The chamar, the donkey driver, that's normal for him to have such a bother. But tzayich, when one rents the donkey, that's the reason why we allow him to place his provisions, his mizaynes for the journey on the donkey. Avodah Ravacha Breid Ravika. Says the Gemara, a story of Acha, the father of Acha, son of Ravika. So we turn over to Samachei, Amid, Beis, Have Shavech Le'u Chamr La'akum. Would pour wine into bottles, into flasks for Goyim. Va'azel Ma'aber Mivra. And he would go and he would carry the wine across the river for them. And the Goyim would give him earthenware barrels, to pay for the wine that they just got. Also, so the people came to Abaye and told him. So they thought that Rav Ika was being over an Isser as he's working with Yain Nesach. Amar Lei, Abaye says, Kika Tarach, when Rav Ika, what's Matriach, when he poured the wine into the barrels, Beitera Katarach. It was permitted wine at that moment. This is another level of Isra of Yain Nesach. Says the Gemara, you're not even allowed to be Roitze B'kiyumai. You can't even desire, can't even want the Yain Nesach to be in existence and facilitating its existence, doing that is Asr as well. Says the Gemara, the right of Bikiyuma is Nitzru Ziku, that the wine, the flask, the skin should not split open. Says the Gemara, the Masu Badayu, you would stipulate with the buyers. Inami, the Masu Pristiki Badayu, or they would bring empty vessels with them. But he would carry them across. Says the Gemara, you would tell the ferryman beforehand to do such, and therefore it was not considered that he was commissioning them to work with the forbidden Yain Nesach. Or the Nikita Bekitri, they had special ropes they knew was their own, and therefore it wasn't Rav Ika who transported the wine on him by himself. Says the Mishnah, Yain Nesach, continuing the halachas of Yain Nesach, Shenafal Agabi Anav, that fell on top of grapes, Yedechan Vehin Mutaris. Rinse it off and it's butter. But if the grapes are cracked open, then Asurais, because the Asur wine goes inside. Nafal Gabi Te'inim, Oyal Gabi Tamarim. If it fell on top of dates, top of figs, if there's enough wine to put flavor into the fig or date, also, he was bringing dried figs on a boat, and and they said it is mutter ve'tiram. And it says the Mishnah Zakla, Kol Shabanasam B'Naisin Tam Aser. Kol Shabanasam B'Naisin Tam is mutter. Kigoin Chaymet Shanaval Gabi Grisa. What is an example? Says the Mishnah, vinegar that falls on split beans. The vinegar has a bad taste in the beans. That's not B'Naisin Tam. Therefore, that would not be a problem. Says the Gemara. Let us begin the Gemara and conclude today's shir. Maisa Listor. We're missing a case in the Mishnah. The Mishnah didn't speak out that detail. If it's a bad taste, then it's mutter. And therefore, that's case that it's aser. That's mutter because it's no time lefkam. It's a bad taste. But therefore, it's going to be mutter. Because it's a bad taste. Explains the Gemara. So a pile of wheat, of which a barrel of 9 nesach was spilled, Shari Rava Rava allowed it to be sold to a goy. One second, why are you allowing to be sold to a goy? He asks, in a case of a beged, that there's some kalayim inside of it, it's lost the threads, I raise the lame kernelakim, can't get any benefit. Can't be a saddle for your donkey. So la'aka, my time aloi. So we see that when something contains an Isser, you're not even allowed to sell it to a guy. Why? Because then it might end up in the hands of a Yid. So ask the Gemara, in our case, is Israel. Why aren't we worried about the same concern? Explains the Gemara, that case is different. You can grind the wheat, bake it, and sell it. Israel, and then there would be no option that eventually might be found in the hands of a Yid, and that's the reason why it would be mutter. Says the Gemara, 1 second, but Tanan, you can rinse it off. So what's going on in our case? In Rava's case that fell in the wheat, why should you just be allowed to rinse off the wheat and it should be mutter? Wheat is different. Why? Since wheat has like a crack in it, a cleft goes into it, it's like the grapes that it cracked, and that's the reason why it was ulcer. Stop over here and we'll pick it up from Daf Samach Vav the next year. B'siyata Tishmai.